You hear chains in the dark, not around your body, but dragging through the soul of a continent. The sound is relentless, echoing across mountains, slithering through valleys, as if the earth itself has been shackled. These are not your chains, and yet their weight bruises your skin. They belong to Africa, carved apart by ink and bayonet, torn into pieces as Europe feasts upon its living body. You see a map, not of parchment, but of human flesh stretched taut, its veins marked as borders, its tears filled with blood. Villages smolder. Names vanish. The proud are broken beneath flags they never raised. And yet, the rhythm falters. A silence intrudes, sudden and sharp, like the intake of breath before defiance. In that silence, a whisper rises, not here, not this land. Ethiopia, jagged mountains like blackened teeth, refuses the butcher's blade. Deep within those highlands, a presence stirs. A king, a lion, watching as the vultures descend. He is not yet crowned by glory, but by waiting, patient, calculating, unyielding. His name will one day roar across the world, Menelik. The chains rattle again, but for the first time they hesitate, trembling against the fortress of a people who will not bow. Here, in the silence of Ethiopia, begins the nightmare of Europe. Reached for Ethiopia, and every time, their hands came back bleeding. The continent bends under the weight of new crowns, crowns forged in iron and gunpowder, pressed onto nations that never asked to wear them. From the north to the southern seas, Africa is dismembered, renamed, erased. But in the highlands of Ethiopia, something resists. The land itself seems carved for defiance. Mountains rise like jagged fortresses, cliffs as walls no cannon can easily pierce. Valleys twist like scars, hiding paths only the locals can read. Rivers choke invaders with floods, while the thin air itself punishes those who dare to march too high. Nature conspires with memory, protecting a kingdom that refuses to kneel. Yet it is not only stone and soil that defy empire. Ethiopia carries an ancient crown, older than the nations that seek to enslave it. A faith tied to Jerusalem, a history echoing with kings and queens who trace their blood to Solomon himself. In a world being reduced to colonies and numbers, Ethiopia stands as a sovereign ghost from another age, unbroken, untamed. And in the whispers of the colonizers, the name carries both fear and desire. Ethiopia, the land they could not yet cage. But if the land is a fortress, it still needs a guardian. And soon, a lion will claim its throne. Before the lion roared, he was a child locked in a cage. Menelik was not born into freedom, but into captivity. Taken as a political hostage by Emperor Tawadros II, the boy lived under the shadow of iron discipline and suspicion. The palace was not a home. It was a prison dressed in royal robes, where every corridor whispered betrayal, and every silence carried the weight of a watchful eye. Imagine it, a child who cannot run in the fields, who learns not from play, but from the cruelty of rulers who see him as both threat and heir. He is fed like a prince, but guarded like a criminal, his future sharpened in the dark like a hidden blade. In the loneliness of those years, something hardens. Menelik watches, listens, absorbs. He sees the fragility of power, how quickly trust rots, how swiftly loyalty becomes ash. He learns the cruelty of men long before he learns the kindness of fate. The grotesque irony is this: captivity was not his end, but his forging. Tawadros thought to cage him, but instead he bred resilience, patience, calculation. In the stillness of his youth, the child became prophecy. One day he would walk free. One day, the boy who knew chains would break the chains of nations. The lion was already awake. He was only waiting to grow. A crown is not always a blessing. Sometimes it is a knife pressed to the skull. When Menelik rose to power, he did not inherit unity. He inherited fracture. Ethiopia was less a kingdom than a storm of rival fiefdoms, each noble sharpening his ambition like a hidden dagger. To sit on the throne was not to command, but to balance, to survive the endless tug of loyalty and betrayal. The land itself seemed to mirror this chaos. Jagged mountains divided provinces, rivers split loyalties, and ancient rivalries cut deeper than steel. Every ally was also a threat, every smile concealing a hunger for the crown. And Menelik, young yet watchful, wore this heavy burden. His rule was not celebrated with songs of triumph, but haunted by whispers of doubt. Could this prince, once a hostage, hold together a realm forever at war with itself? He learned to rule not by trust, but by vigilance. He offered gifts with one hand and sharpened swords with the other. His authority grew not from harmony, but from the fragile balance of fear and respect. To govern Ethiopia was to walk across burning coals, every step a test, every moment a chance to collapse into fire. But Menelik did not collapse. He endured, and as the crown dug deeper into his flesh, it prepared him for the shadows soon to fall from across the sea. It did not begin with gunfire, but with a whisper. Europe arrives first as a shadow. At first, it was not armies that crossed the seas, but maps, merchants, priests. Their weapons were not yet rifles, but smiles, treaties, gifts wrapped in velvet. The colonizers always came dressed in civility, their daggers hidden beneath silk. In Ethiopia, the signs appeared like cracks in stone. Foreign envoys with polite words, explorers sketching the mountains, missionaries claiming to bring light while measuring every shadow. They offered technology, rifles, railways, but always with a string tied, an invisible leash. From the distance, you could almost mistake it for friendship. Yet the air itself seemed poisoned with intent. For beyond those polite handshakes stood an entire continent already bleeding. Algeria burning under French boots. Congo reduced to a graveyard by Belgian greed. The British carving borders as if Africa were clay in their hands. And now, the Italians. A kingdom desperate for glory, hungry for colonies, eager to brand itself with conquest. They gazed upon Ethiopia not as a sovereign nation, but as prey left behind while others feasted. Menelik could feel it. The shadow was lengthening across his mountains, slow but relentless. What Europe could not conquer with force, it would attempt with paper. The rifles had not yet fired, but the war had already begun, written in ink that smelled of blood. Some chains are not made of iron, they are written in ink. In 1889, the Treaty of Wuchale was placed before Menelik, its pages dressed in diplomacy, its words cloaked in courtesy. To the Italians, it was a triumph, a quiet snare disguised as partnership. Two languages carried the same treaty, but not the same truth. In the Amharic text, Ethiopia was recognized as a sovereign state, free to speak with the world. But in the Italian version, a fatal poison dripped between the lines. Ethiopia reduced to a protectorate, its voice chained to Italy's tongue, its freedom swallowed under the mask of alliance. It was not conquest by sword, but by semantics, a theft not of land, but of dignity. And to Europe, it was cleverness, a trick to shackle a nation without firing a single bullet. But Menelik was no fool. He read deeper. He sensed the treachery, the hidden knife. He knew that paper could cut as sharply as steel, and that this treaty was nothing less than an ambush. The ink had barely dried when the betrayal revealed itself, and the shadow of war thickened. The Italians believed they had already won, that the lion had stepped willingly into their cage. But a lion does not mistake rope for chain. It waits, and then it strikes. This treaty would not bind Ethiopia. It would ignite it. A lion does not roar for vanity. It roars to warn the world that blood is coming. When the deception of Wuchale reached its breaking point, Menelik did not crumble. He did not bow. Instead, the quiet king transformed into something Europe had not expected, a sovereign who would rather set his land aflame than see it chained. Messengers rode through the highlands like sparks on dry grass. Letters carried his words far and wide, calling every village, every noble, every farmer into one cause. Spears were lifted from doorways, rifles unburied from the earth. The nation that outsiders saw as fragmented began to stir, pieces pulling together as if summoned by destiny. In the churches, priests thundered that defending Ethiopia was defending God himself. In the fields, peasants shouldered weapons they barely knew how to use, driven not by training, but by fury. Even the mountains seemed to awaken, their ridges echoing with the rhythm of drums and the tramp of gathering feet. To Italy, this was unthinkable. How could a kingdom of farmers resist the steel of Europe? But to Menelik, every farmer was a soldier, every prayer a sword, every heartbeat a drum of war. The lion had awoken, and its roar would soon shake the world. When a storm gathers in the highlands, it does not whisper, it devours the horizon. From the north to the southern valleys, Ethiopia began to move. It was not an army in the European sense. It was a tide of humanity, rising and converging. Nobles summoned their retainers, peasants abandoned their plows, priests marched with crosses raised like banners of war. Women carried food and water, their footsteps no less vital than the spears in men's hands. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. Villages emptied, roads filled with dust, drums thundered across the mountains. The scale was biblical, not a mobilization, but a migration. To outsiders, it appeared chaotic, untrained, undisciplined. Yet beneath the surface beat a single pulse, unity born of defiance. Italy thought Ethiopia was fractured, weak, a kingdom of scattered tribes. But what they saw now was a storm that fused those tribes into one body, one will. Faith bound them, hunger drove them, the memory of chains hardened them. Menelik himself stood at the center of this gathering, not as a distant monarch, but as a presence carried in every chant, every march, every prayer. His call had become prophecy, and the people answered with their lives. To Europe, the storm seemed madness. To Ethiopia, it was destiny, and destiny was marching toward Adwa. On the eve of slaughter, silence is louder than war. The night before Adwa was not filled with chaos, but with an eerie stillness. Across the darkened highlands, thousands of campfires glowed like scattered stars fallen to earth. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and fear, but above it all, hymns carried through the wind. Imagine standing there, the ground trembling not from battle, but from voices. Tens of thousands chanting prayers in unison, the sound weaving through valleys, echoing against cliffs. The hymns were not gentle. They were thunder, a plea to heaven sharpened into a weapon. Menelik moved among his people, calm and deliberate, his presence less a king and more a prophet. His words did not promise safety. They promised struggle, sacrifice, blood. And still, the people listened, their eyes burning with the same quiet fire as the campfires around them. In that fragile silence, there was no illusion. Every man and woman knew that dawn might be their last. Yet there was no retreat, no collapse, only a calm acceptance that history itself was waiting on the other side of sunrise. The Italians slept as well, certain of their rifles and discipline. But the mountains, the night, the very air seemed to lean toward Ethiopia. Morning would decide whose silence became eternal. Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with the scream of steel. When the first light spilled over the highlands of Adwa, it revealed a nightmare the Italians had not imagined. The mountains themselves seemed alive, every ridge, every slope crawling with Ethiopian fighters. From the valleys below, chants rose like thunder, a human storm descending upon a European army that believed itself invincible. The Italians marched in fractured columns, their maps betraying them, their arrogance blinding them. They expected scattered rebels. Instead, they found a nation. Waves of warriors crashed down from the rocks, rifles firing, spears thrusting, swords cleaving. The sound was not a battle, it was an avalanche. Bodies fell like broken dolls across the ravines. Gunfire snapped through the air, But for every Ethiopian who fell, two more surged forward, driven by fury older than the invaders could comprehend. Women carried water through fields of corpses, priests lifted crosses amid clouds of gunpowder, nobles charged with swords flashing like lightning. The Italians staggered. Their discipline dissolved into terror. What used were tactics when the land itself seemed to turn against them. What used were rifles when the enemy was endless, when even the dead seemed to rise in the chance of the living. By noon, the dream of empire had become a grave. European arrogance shattered on Ethiopian stone. Menelik's roar was not heard in words, but in the silence of the Italian guns, dropped and abandoned in blood-soaked earth. Adwa was no battle. It was dismemberment, and the world would never forget the day the lion devoured the hunter. When the smoke cleared at Adwa, it was not only soldiers who lay broken, it was Europe's illusion of supremacy. News of the defeat spread like wildfire, carried on telegraphs and whispers, each message heavier than the last. In Rome, disbelief curdled into rage. Italy, eager to brand itself as a colonial power, now stood humiliated before the very empires it sought to imitate. Its soldiers lay scattered in Ethiopian soil, its pride bleeding out with them. Across Europe, shock turned to silence. Newspapers struggled to print the truth that a so-called backward African kingdom had crushed a modern European army. The myth of inevitability, that Africa existed only to be conquered, shattered overnight. But while Europe reeled, Africa listened. From Cairo to Cape Town, from the Sahara to the coastlines of the Atlantic, whispers spread. The lion had won. The impossible had become real. For the colonized, Adwa was more than a battle. It was a prophecy, proof that chains could break, that the hunter could bleed. Yet triumph was not without its shadow. The dead still covered Ethiopia's soil. Victory was costly, and Menelik knew that even in humiliation, Europe was not finished. Still, for one moment, the world stood witness to the unthinkable. A king in Africa had forced an empire to kneel. A crown is not a shield from loneliness. Even lions grow weary on their throne. In the glow of victory, Menelik II sat taller than any king in Africa. To his people, he was the Lion of Judah, the guardian of Ethiopia's sovereignty, the ruler who had crushed the European dream of conquest. Yet within the gilded halls of his palace, silence lingered. Triumph carries weight. The cheers of the people could not drown out the whispers of betrayal, nor could parades erase the faces of the dead. Menelik's reign became a paradox. He was celebrated as untouchable, yet he knew how fragile his world remained. He expanded roads, strengthened trade, and sought to modernize his nation, for he had seen what waited beyond the horizon if Ethiopia faltered. But even as progress surged, the cracks deepened. Famine struck. Old rivalries simmered beneath the surface. The throne, heavy with honor, was also heavy with dread. The lion roared, but he was also a man, aging, burdened, aware that history was merciless. He had beaten back the invader, but could he beat the slow erosion of time, of hunger, of division? Every crown, after all, is borrowed. Empires rarely collapse from the strike of an enemy. More often, they rot from the silence within. Beneath the triumph of Adwa, Ethiopia carried wounds that victory could not heal. The empire was vast, stitched together by conquest and fragile alliances, but unity was never permanent. Local rulers whispered in the dark, their loyalty bound more to convenience than conviction. Old rivalries, buried under the roar of war, began to stir once more. Menelik II faced storms that no army could fight. Famine swept across the land, devouring villages and hollowing the eyes of his people. Disease spread like a curse, mocking the grandeur of palaces and the banners of victory. Progress was slow, uneven, and for every road built, another rift cracked open. Even the court itself carried shadows. Jealousies brewed, ambitions flared, and the weight of the crown grew heavier. Menelik, once the fiery lion of battle, was aging. His body weakened, and with it, so too did his grip on a restless empire. The horror of Adwa had been clear and bloody, but the horror of ruling was quieter, crueler. The slow decay of power, the betrayal of friends, the realization that victory on the battlefield cannot conquer hunger, sickness, or time. The lion still roared, but the echo trembled. Even lions, no matter how fierce, must one day crawl into the shadows of their own silence. The final years of Menelik II's life unfolded not with the thunder of battle, but with the frailty of a fading body. Illness struck like an unseen assassin, leaving the once mighty emperor weakened, his voice softened, his movements halting. The Lion of Judah, who had once commanded armies and defied empires, now struggled against the relentless advance of time. In the palace, whispers grew louder. Who would inherit the throne? Who would carry Ethiopia's fragile unity forward? As Menelik lay bedridden, his court became a theater of intrigue, his empire a chessboard of rival ambitions. Power slipped through his fingers, not taken by enemies on horseback, but by the creeping inevitability of mortality. The people still revered him, but reverence could not stop decay. The lion who had roared at Adwa now spoke only in murmurs, his gaze carrying the weight of victories and regrets alike. In his silence, Ethiopia saw both its triumph and its fragility. The lion had not been slain. He had simply grown tired. The dead do not speak, yet their silence is often louder than the lies of the living. Menelik II's body eventually succumbed, but his shadow never left Ethiopia. His victory at Adwa carved itself into stone, a warning etched against the arrogance of empires. Yet within that triumph lay a forbidden truth, one history books rarely admit. Power is never pure, and even the greatest victories bleed. Ethiopia stood uncolonized, a beacon for the oppressed across Africa, but the empire was still scarred. The famine, the rivalries, the whispers of betrayal, these, too, were part of Menelik's legacy. His crown carried not only glory, but fractures that would outlive him. And perhaps that is the true horror of history, that every triumph carries seeds of its own undoing. Europe feared Adwa not only because they lost, but because it shattered their myth of inevitability. If Ethiopia could stand, then others could rise. If the chains could break once, they could break again. This was the truth whispered in dark rooms, censored in classrooms, denied in polite conversation. That an emperor in Africa, dismissed as lesser, primitive, disposable, had forced the world to kneel. But truth is never comfortable. It cuts deeper than swords, leaving wounds that never heal. And so Menelik's story lingers, not as legend, not as myth, but as a mirror. A reminder that empires fall, pride rots, and the lion always leaves behind a silence heavier than its roar. The forbidden truth is this: victory is never the end.